in the cybersecurity ecosystem. And it's not just what can we volunteer to do, which I've heard in so many conferences, or what would be nice, but what do we owe? And that is a very loaded word, and I chose it deliberately. We don't talk a lot anymore about what we owe one another in a society. We live in a society, and we don't talk much anymore about civic duty or, what obligations we have to one another. We might in other areas, but in terms of cybersecurity, we haven't really used that word yet, I don't think. We've always treated it as a very individualistic sort of pursuit. And if you got hacked, well, I'm sure you did something wrong to deserve it. And, you take care of your infrastructure, I'll take care of my infrastructure. And, the reality is we can't do that anymore. First of all, there's the really old joke about the two hikers seeing a bear, and one of the hikers says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you." And I've never liked that joke, but anyway, it's not relevant anymore because there is more than enough bear to go around. It is not a matter anymore of just being a little more secure so that the bear will move on to another, weaker victim. Thanks to automation, if you've got a vulnerability, everybody can be found within a certain amount of time. So the way we think about security has got to change. We can't just make it us versus our fellow hikers anymore. There's a great report that Risk Recon, which is from MasterCard, did together with the Scientia Institute. And if you don't know the Scientia folks, they are also some of the folks who founded the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. So you know they're legit. And this report was about the continuing impact of incidents affecting multiple parties. And I love that they keep talking about the ripple effect. One of the things that I got out of their initial report is that breaches affect more than just the target organization. One example was the Blackbaud ransomware attack that affected 550 different organizations, including nonprofits in healthcare. Now, we do know to get excited about healthcare, but what a lot of people don't realize is nonprofits are the other critical infrastructure. If you think about it, when nonprofits get attacked, when they get brought down, they cannot fulfill their functions, which are often involved with feeding hungry people, providing first responder services in cases of disaster, helping victims of human trafficking, helping to protect people, all sorts of things. And if they can't operate, then that critical infrastructure for the beneficiaries of their work also goes away. So 550 different organizations from one attack on a platform. Another thing that came out from their report is that if you are a victim of a breach ripple effect, if somebody else gets breached and you feel the effects, 1 in 4 of you are going to end up paying all the costs, including the costs of the organization that originally got breached. So I don't think we really appreciate just how much cybersecurity incidents cost completely innocent people, innocent victims, through these ripple effects. And so if we're all sharing this risk, it requires shared defenses. This is, the slogan I'm going to campaign on, because any one of us can take anybody else down at any given time, whether you're big or small. You just need to be dangerous enough with BGP or whatever. And so we all have shared risk, and that means we have to defend together. And there's somebody really important who agrees with me, who is the US National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, who gave me this quote: "The notion of a shared defense is a statement of reality, not choice. We are stuck with this. We are stuck with each other. And we really do have to think about shared defense." So let me talk first about what I call the security poverty line, the circumstances for organizations that can't effectively protect themselves for a lot of different reasons. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I started talking about it in 2011. I'm going to keep going. There are all sorts of reasons why an organization can't protect itself. And it's not just a matter of them being stupid or being too cheap to pay for security or being lazy or being malicious. There are actual dynamics in play that are, in a lot of cases, very similar to regular poverty, which makes it hard to climb out of. What I believe that they need are in these four areas. They need money, of course, that's part of it, but they also need expertise, they need capability, and they need influence. So, what do I mean by these? First of all, can they actually afford the financial costs of tools and people for security? I would argue that we do not know how much security actually costs. We don't know what you actually need for effective security. We don't know how to price it out for any given organization. And then they also need expertise. Do they know what constitutes essential security and how to go about implementing it? That's another big problem. When I was at 451 Research, I did some research with this hypothetical question. I went to a bunch of security professionals and I said, I'm a new CISO. It's my first day on the job in an organization that has never done security before. What should I buy? And you would not believe the different answers that I got from people. There were people who said, that's a stupid question. That would never happen. Well, guess what? It was actually my issue the first day on a job at an organization where I walked in as the CISO. I was the only person who was dedicated to security, and I had to figure out what to do. And they said to me when I walked in, we need your budget request by the end of the day. So I had to sit in front of an empty Excel spreadsheet and try to figure out what I needed to buy. I got all sorts of questions. And when you ask it as an open-ended question like this, you don't give them a checklist. It's interesting how different the answers are based on the professional and their background. I talked to people who listed 4 different technologies as a baseline. Here's the minimum that you need to get. And I talked to others who listed 31 different technologies as a baseline. You can kind of imagine that the ones who listed over 30 different technologies worked for a bank where they're used to buying one of everything. So figuring out what you should buy is the first part. And even if you get a list, the other problem is that you take that list to vendors and you want to know what they're going to cost, and they'll say, well, it depends. And, it depends on your size, it depends on your vertical, it depends on what kind of other infrastructure you have. And I need to have at least 2 hours of a sales call with you first before I can start even telling you what the list price is for what you're trying to price out. That was my own experience. So even the experts don't know. And a lot of people came to me and said, well, I cannot possibly answer this question. Even if you said it was a 1,000-person organization, I still can't tell you what you need to buy until you give me a whole lot more answers. So if we can't tell people as professionals what they need for effective security, how are they supposed to figure that out? This is a big problem. I can tell you that from that research, the minimum baselines that professionals listed pretty much matched up to PCI DSS. And they included both firewalls and antivirus. Now, I know a lot of people are saying firewalls are dead, AV is dead, but you can't not list them in a shopping list. That's the problem. You can't say, no, you don't need firewalls. Don't buy any firewalls. In fact, one person came to me and said, well, you don't buy anything for a year. You sit there and you do a risk assessment. And I thought, well, that's great. We're going to sit here for a year without firewalls. That's a good idea. The other problem is because there's such a wide range of different technologies, different prices, the number of people you think you need to run it, and what you're going to pay for those people, your budget could be off by as much as a factor of 4. And there's still no guarantee that you won't get breached. So we don't know whether organizations can afford the security that they need, and we don't know whether they can afford the expertise that they need. This is a big problem. Even assuming that they know what to do, or assuming they get a consultant who says, okay, you need to do this and this and this, can they carry it out? Or are they blocked by situations or logistics? Uh, there are so many different environments out there. If you say to them, you need to get this and this for network security, and they say, but we don't run our own network and they won't let us put anything on the network, then you're kind of stuck. There are all sorts of situations where um, conventional wisdom says that you should be doing a particular thing, but you just can't do it. In the public sector, good stewardship of taxpayer money involves using your infrastructure as long as you possibly can for as long as it works until it falls over. And when it finally starts breaking down and you can't deliver the service anymore, then you go back to the legislature and say, it's broken. We have to replace it. Can we replace it now? But you don't appreciate just how difficult it is to get money for what people see as gratuitous upgrades until you've worked in the public sector or any organization that doesn't have a lot of money. I read some report somewhere that stated that the margins and retail in small convenience stores like 7-Eleven for the food that they sell and everything is only 1%. If you're only getting 1% margins, unlike a tech company which has margins of 10 to 12%, there's not a lot you can spend on security, even if you wanted to. So there are a lot of things that hold back an organization that, again, have nothing to do with not wanting to spend the money, not wanting to do it, not knowing they need to do it. It's that they can't. Here's another example of how a company culture drives what you can do in cybersecurity. There are different companies, some are bleeding to lead, and so every time you wanna buy something new and cool, like deception technology, they're all over it, and they say, "Oh, yes, we gotta do this," and others are not. If you were in hospitality, one major rule is never disrupt the guest experience. Never, 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 because guests can leave one brand and not come back for 6 or 7 years if you upset your guest. So, does this mean that you can issue all of your hotel guests MFA? Probably not. They're not going to sit still for it. Other things, if you are working for a security vendor, then we better be good at it ourselves, and you may be able to make a good argument for getting things, um, but maybe not if you're a startup and you're not going to spend anything until you absolutely have to. And timing is everything. So there are a lot of dynamics in play here. There are two big dichotomies that I'm sure you all know about: safety versus security and privacy versus security. And again, it depends on the type of organization you're working for. I remember a quote from a doctor that said, I do not want my patient dying on the gurney with his privacy intact. So availability is all in healthcare. Doesn't matter whether it's secure or not, it had better be available. And yes, I know you're going to say, but ransomware. And yes, everybody is running into that conflict right now. But still, if you make it too hard for a doctor to log in an operating room, you're still going to be in trouble, whether there's ransomware involved or not. So again, all of these things have to be balanced: risk versus cost, and different types of risk versus cost when you're trying to implement security. And then finally, what organizations need is influence. Can they make their suppliers and their stakeholders make the changes that they need? When you're working for a large company like Cisco, you can say to your supplier, we're going to need you to fix that or else we're canceling the contract, and they'll do it. If you're working for a small Texas state agency, you're working with very small vendors, sometimes two people vendors that are on a state contract, and they will say, well, nobody else has complained about this, so we're not going to fix it. Or we'll fix it if you pay us to fix it. But of course, you never budgeted for paying your vendor to fix all the mistakes that they put in the software. So influence is a very hard thing. And I think that we as professionals, when we hear about security security initiatives with really large companies, we don't realize how much of it is due to influence and their ability to ask for and get things, as opposed to smaller organizations and less influential ones. If you want to put comments in the chat box, please do. I love a good knockdown, drag out chat. Please go right ahead. So here's what everybody needs. We all need these. We need money, we need expertise, we need capability, and we need influence. So how do we fix this? We should be starting with fundamentals like addressing the money problem that a lot of organizations have. We need to be able to get them expertise, not awareness. It really drives me crazy when people on Twitter talk about, well, they just needed more awareness training. They weren't aware that this could happen. Of course they were aware it could happen. They either couldn't head it off for one reason or another, or they thought it wouldn't happen just yet. And so they need actual expertise, not somebody beating them with a clue stick. They also need the capability. So we might talk about their ability to migrate from legacy environments where you simply cannot implement the things that you need for security. So what do we owe one another, other people, organizations that cannot do this themselves? Let's talk about the money issue, because I know this is going to be a really touchy point with everybody. So here are a few questions I've been thinking about. Is there a minimum amount on security that everyone should be spending, or if they can't spend it, the government should provide? Should we be giving grants to organizations that have certain, margins below a certain threshold, or that are below a certain amount of revenue, or who get below a certain amount of donations, that we understand that it's unrealistic for them to be able to buy the security that they need. They're going to need help. And people do talk about open source, but I'm here to point out that open source software does not help you at all if you need people to run it. You're back to the money problem and you're back to the expertise problem. Now, this may not be as much of a problem in other parts of the world. In South America, for example, there are areas where skilled labor is relatively cheap. And so they rely heavily on open source security software because they can really afford people who can learn how to run it and can run it. They can get whatever they need. That's not necessarily the case here. I think I had heard at some point about a job opening for a senior analyst at FireEye where they were offering a base salary of $500,000. So you can imagine that they were stealing, people away from other places. Unless you have enough money for that kind of resourcing, there is no way you can compete with security vendors for that expertise. So, this is something we need to address. Should some basic security infrastructure or controls be provided as a subsidized service? Is it time to say, look, identity and access management is too complex and too hard. We really need to centralize it and offer services. Now, some states are working on that sort of thing, providing it at the very least to their own state agencies. So centralizing things like that, assuming you can do that, should we be doing even more of that? And what security should be built in and therefore available at no extra charge? Uh, there have been some complaints about certain types of security functionality that you have to pay an upcharge for rather than getting it with the base edition of the software that you're buying from a vendor. And there have been discussions at roundtables, like, for example, at the Atlantic Council, we talked about this. Were there some minimum things that government should be requiring of providers, that at the very least they should be providing the same level of logging to everybody so that if an incident happens, they have what they need? Are there certain types of security functionality that nobody should be upcharging for? That should be a lively discussion. I would love to hear that. Let's go on to expertise. What do we owe other people who can't get the expertise that they need? Well, it's time to just bury the information sharing thing. Everybody says, yes, we should share information. First of all, in threat intelligence, it's not that easy. It's not that complete. I have a whole talk on that subject, but there's more that we can do rather than just saying we should be sharing IOCs, which are really just big ass signatures. Change my mind. Um, Efforts like the recently discussed NTSB for cyber, the National Transportation Safety Board, something like that for cyber, which would investigate large scale cybersecurity incidents that affected a lot of organizations. Something like that could help increase general knowledge if it were done right, where we would be able to hear details of things that normally nobody will talk about because sometimes those details are crucial. I will argue this over and over again. Security products should be designed to require less arcane security expertise. You should not necessarily need to be a security person to run a security tool, especially in non-technical verticals, in smaller organizations. Even the people who are running IT are not necessarily IT people. So we have to take that under consideration. Visibility and transparency are a part of information sharing, and yes, they're necessary. But if you give a mouse an S-bomb, what are they going to do with it? If you give a CISO an S-bomb, you have to know what to do with what you receive. And so just doing more visibility and more transparency and throwing more data at an organization or a security team is not going to help them do anything useful with it. So whatever we develop has to come with more built-in expertise and built-in assistance so that it can be useful out of the box instead of, well, you need to take 6 weeks of training first, and then you need to get this certification, and then, oh, you set 500 controls wrong. That is just not fair to the customers that we serve. We need to be getting better at this. And then finally, expanding the talent pool. We need to support all entry paths into cybersecurity and push for retention efforts. It's not just about getting young, impressionable college students and getting them in. We should be pulling people in from all walks of life, from all levels of career into cybersecurity, and then working very hard to keep them there. I myself am a liberal arts dropout, never had a computer class. Make of that what you will. But I'm here to tell you that until we change how we look for candidates, we are always going to have a talent shortage. Moving on now to capability. How do we help other organizations get the capability that they need? I've been playing with some of these. I don't know how well these are going to work, but we need to enable better tech refresh and integration practices. And the reason I'm saying this is because at Cisco, we worked with the Scientia Institute to do research on what actually works in security, not what people are doing, but whether it works. And so we found from last year's study, after surveying 4,800 organizations around the world and asking them about 25 different security practices and mapping them against 11 different security outcomes that you might want from your program. We compared them one to one to see if any of the practices had any statistical effect on the outcomes. And the two that appeared to have the most effect on all of the outcomes that you might want across the board, from being able to keep up with the business to maintaining compliance requirements, recruiting and retaining talent, getting buy-in from peer departments, everything. The top two most statistically significant practices were a proactive technology refresh strategy and good integration practices. Now, you might think that this is very convenient for Cisco and everything. And also, I thought it was a Silicon Valley sort of thing, just a cultural thing that newer is always better and you can get by just fine. So even I was surprised at the extent to which these two practices statistically stood out as having an effect on the strength of the program. So if you cannot afford to proactively refresh all your technology all the time? And if integration is hard, what are you supposed to do? This is why I'm saying that we need to get better at these top two practices. And that means redesigning what we have. And that may mean migrating to infrastructure that is easier to refresh. For example, you can imagine that we also found in our study this year, when we looked into it deeper, that having a vendor do the refresh means it gets done a lot more often than if you have to make time to do it yourself. I'm just saying, it may be terribly obvious to everybody, but if we really want organizations to get better at security, maybe we should be focusing on a couple of really strong practices and trying to get them there. Along the same vein, if we could move non-core business functions to the cloud, um, that will also make for easier integration, better tech refreshing, and easier for that organization to deal with something that, they're not specializing in anyway. Payroll has been outsourced and in the cloud for decades. It's been a really long time. Their email, more and more and more, it's at least being moved to the cloud, even if you're still running it yourself from the cloud. So there are a lot of things that are well understood non-core business functions that could be standardized with a provider that would help lift some of the burden off of other organizations. Now, we also need some vertical specific security reference architectures, not just compliance checklists. And I know the NCCOE at NIST does a lot of this work. I wish they could do more of it. Maybe we could throw some more money at them. But vertical specific security reference architecture. So we don't just say you need one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these, and we don't tell them how to put it together. Again, this goes back to both expertise and capability. If it comes pre-assembled and pre-integrated, that's going to work a whole lot better. And then finally, is there a shared responsibility model that we can actually agree on as an industry? I know we talk about it, but my feeling is that often we talk about shared responsibility only to blame the victim of a breach when something happens, to say, well, this was your responsibility and you didn't do it. That's not going to hold water much longer, because I believe that customers are going to come back and say, we shouldn't have had to be in charge of this. It should have been part of your package. And just this week, I found a great tweet. Speaking of Log4j or Log4j, however you want to pronounce it. What's that famous Tyson quote? Everyone has a shared responsibility model until they get punched in the logs. So we are going to be talking even more about shared responsibility as a result of what's going on now. It's time. Finally, what we owe in terms of influence. How are we going to deal with the influence problem? Incentives. We need to be talking about more incentives. We need to reduce risk externalities, where every organization, again, can say, we're taking care of our moat, our firewalls, our security. That thing over there is not our problem, because guess what? It will be sooner or later. There was a discussion during the SolarWinds Sunburst attack about identifying linchpin components of the security ecosystem. Really important providers, all know who they are, the really big ones, and saying, what should we be expecting from those linchpin providers? How do we identify them as linchpins? And then what more should we be expecting? Should we be enforcing certain levels of security from those very, very important parts of our ecosystem? Now, the other thing that actually Helen Patton pointed out to me that I thought was really smart is that, risk-driven regulation tends to be driven by the loudest and the biggest organizations out there, which tend to be financial institutions. They tend to be really, really big tech companies, and they have their own capabilities and their own budgets and things like that. And they implement security in a way that may not be feasible for everybody else. But we see all of these examples promoted at conferences of really, really big organizations because Microsoft can send 10 people to speak at a conference about what they're doing. And it's great. And I'm sure it's, state of the art, top of the line. Can or should I be doing this as the Texas Department of Insurance? I am not so sure. I'm not sure if I even could, even if I wanted to. So we need to be balancing this type of regulation activity so that we're not just drawing examples and risk scenarios and risk mitigation practices from the top of our industry, from the ones with the most money and the most megaphones. We need to be balancing that with the rest of the population, and so that we can have regulation that works better for everybody. And then we need to address the big elephant in the room, or whatever large animal you want to call it. The problem is that cybersecurity is hard to deal with as a global policy issue because it's a lot of everything. It is both a military issue and a civil issue on the same infrastructure at the same time, from 1 millisecond to another. It can be used as weapons, or it can be used for life-saving transactions. It is cross-border, even though we don't treat it that way. I was listening to Andrea Limbago earlier today, and she pointed out that we are facing a sort of a splinter net, in that governments are dividing up how they treat the internet based on their own interests and policies. And so your experience of the internet is going to end up being different depending on where you sit geographically at any given time. So yes, internet is cross-border, and yet it's not being treated that way. The stakeholders, there are a lot of policy initiatives that are going on, all sorts of different norms discussions, but they tend not to include everybody. They will either include governments but not private sector, or not commercial operators. They might exclude different countries along political lines, depending on who you don't like today. And so those efforts, or they're only regional, they're only European, they're only US, none of those are going to work. We have to create a bigger policy sphere that even includes the people who we think might not have anything useful to say because they're too small. We should include people who and organizations that don't have the biggest wallets out there, and we should include nations that yeah, we're happy to do business with you, but we're also going to block things that you're trying to ship us in the supply chain. How is that going to work exactly? Anyway, we need to address that big, massive problem, because collective influence is the only way that we are going to address this problem. And we owe it to one another to try to build that collective influence, because piecemeal is just not working. Now, that was a lot. I am not going to say that this is easy. I believe that solving these problems may well be as complicated as us trying to solve US healthcare reform. There are economic issues, technology issues, political issues, cultural issues, you name it. There are so many different dynamics in cybersecurity that have to be addressed. But I believe it's very important that we do it, because it is a pragmatic as well as a moral imperative. Not just that cybersecurity is fully capable of causing harm on an ongoing basis to vulnerable populations, but we will live in a better world too, as if we start addressing this problem. From a purely pragmatic point of view, we need to do this. All right, let's have a fight. Who wants to fight me? Let's do this. Oh my God, they're all gone. Let me see. Rich, you got some comments here? I'm seeing some really good. Now I'm looking at the chat window, so let me start with some of these. Um, Oh, William Lewis is asking, well, since you have to pay for expertise, whether you pay for the an open source solution or whether it's proprietary, why are you opposed to open source solutions? I'm not. I should have explained that more clearly. I'm not opposed to open source. I'm just saying it's not the answer for people saying, well, if you don't have money, use open source, because as I pointed out, you still have to pay for the expertise. When it comes to security poverty, just saying open source over and over again is not an answer. Let me see. Rich is saying that most companies still need to pay for consulting hours to set up any paid tools, so open source still saves the cost of the product. Maybe it depends on the design of the product. For example, for as long as I've been working with Duo, they do not offer any consultant services to set up the product, with the theory being that it should be easy enough for you to set it up yourself. Now, you can argue that with me, as much as you want, but I have run into CISOs who accidentally rolled it out further than they had planned to, but it was okay because they didn't get any help desk calls. So, you know, it really depends. Marco Tietz points out very correctly that at least in the US, the government isn't looked at the right place to hold centralization. That is very true. And that's another cultural thing. In the US, we do not trust our government. If you go to Estonia, it's a completely different picture. So, where would we find and set up these centralized services? Taking into account the cultural biases or the beliefs or the norms of different parts of the world, yeah, that's a problem. I'm not sure. Um, the more we can make it regional at the very least, we'll start making things better. But again, that's a discussion we have to have. Maybe it's not identity and access management that should be centralized because we can't agree on it and it means too much psychologically to people, but we could centralize some other security functions. Let me see. Yes, and William points out that Estonia is constantly under attack by nation states. Well, so are we. you know so they take education in cybersecurity very seriously, and they should, and we should, and we're not yet. So we could do a much better job here in the US of taking cybersecurity seriously and not saying, well, it's a military thing or it's a hacker thing, because cyber. I think we need to make it clear, and we're learning this the hard way, that it is all of our problems, especially when utilities go out, or or hospitals are affected, or you can't get your Starbucks, or name your critical infrastructure. Let's see, and Marco just asked, regarding Log4j or Log4j, there were very impression cooperation efforts, Twitter Spaces. Could that scale? I've done a lot of work with ISACs, and I've also taken part in some exercises like Cyberstorm. I took part in DHS's Cyberstorm 5 exercise, and in my experience, the biggest problem that we're facing that we really should solve is ad hoc secure communication among organizations. Because if you join an ISAC and you set up the communication channels, that's easy, that's great, and you're all set. But if you have to call up a retailer and say, I promise I'm not selling anything, but I have some intel that I really need to, about an insider threat that I really need to give to somebody there. Could you please get the CISO to call me back, please? That sort of ad hoc, mutual authentication and getting a way to set this up as it's needed at scale is something that we should be working on right now. The end of the Cyberstorm 5 exercise actually happened. The scenario was, if you found a public and private key pair, you could set up your own CNC in order to disrupt the ransomware that was bricking everything around the world. But the problem is they stopped after the contestants found the key pair. And for me, the question would have been a lot more interesting if we talked about how are we going to get that key pair secretly to everybody who needs it, or stand up a CNC as a service for companies that can't do it themselves without the adversary knowing that we were doing it. That for me was the bigger problem. And so it's not just the sort of steak and ale ISACs where you're sitting around having a dinner and sharing information. It's what you do and who you call when the rubber hits the road. And I do not believe that a government can scale to take care of it alone. I think it has to be done, in parallel, and private sector and nonprofits and everyone need to be able to take this on themselves instead of waiting for everything to go through the government. Because if you think about it, the government has controls on it about what has to be classified, what must be sanitized, what can be shared, for very good reasons. We want to keep our government under control, so we do, but those controls make it harder to be agile and to be as responsive as we need them to be when there's a large scale emergency. But that's my own opinion. Let me see what Sasso says. Uh-oh, Sasso's here. I got to be careful. Should we start borrowing from our partners in confusion, safety, and privacy and increase the regulatory pressure on software vendors with limited liability for security flaws? That is a good question. And it's something that we should be talking about, and it needs to be talked about by people like you who know what the implications are going to be, where we cannot just say, you've got to roll out non-SMS MFA to everybody, because that's impossible. First of all, it's if you are dealing with external parties, you can't tell them, what form of MFA to use. Most of the rest of the world is not even using smartphones. So you cannot give them an app and say, you've got to use this app. You can't send out hard tokens. There are, just all sorts of reasons why SMS is going to be the IE6 of MFA for a very long time to come, because it's the cheapest, it works, it's easiest to set up ad hoc, even if it's not the most secure. Again, it's that balance. So I don't know, but we should be looking at, what use would regulations play? What kind of collective influence should we be setting to bear in order to improve security for everybody, but improve security in the right way based on what your culture thinks security ought to be doing? Yeah, good luck with that. William Lewis says, I think CISOs are more concerned about appearance than effective cybersecurity. No, William, I'm going to disagree with you here. If you are a CISO and you're trying to get things done, you are trying to do the right thing. Most people I know are trying to do the right thing. They're not going to say, well, if I hand wave, people will go away and let me go back to my nap. They really are trying. It's just that if you talk to anybody and they trust you, they will tell you all the reasons why they can't do that incredibly obvious thing that you think is easy. So I don't like any explanation that describes CISOs as stupid or lazy or malicious or apathetic or anything like that. There probably are some people like that out there, but for the most part, everybody I talk to is trying their best with what they have, even if it's just like a little bag clip. Can I put this on a cable somewhere? Is it going to make a difference? Let's just try it. It's hard out there, and we don't hear about it at conferences because nobody's going to get up on stage and say, security is really hard for my company. Nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to say security is really easy for my company, because everybody's going to go pull and start shooting at them. So have I ever been at a startup? Oh yes. The CEO is often about putting off security, because here is a central tenet to business. You do not pay for anything you don't absolutely have to until you absolutely have to. You're not going about, wasting money on something that may not happen yet. So this is why if you're two people in a garage, you are not gonna you're not gonna hire a CISO as your third person. It's just not the right time yet. there was a really good discussion that the FTC held in a kind of a roadshow about how startups should start with security and where you should start. And of course, having secure infrastructure just to work with, like a Chromebook and, just Google Mail. Don't try to set up your own mail server. Is the start, but then at which point should you start introducing other things, secure coding practices? When should you start, monitoring 24/7 as opposed to just asking somebody to check the logs every so often? And how do you balance those costs as you're trying to build your business and get to market? Because that's what you really need. If you're not selling, security is not going to help you. So it's really, really, it's really tough. And I would love to see more research done around what is the best timing for adding security and those security costs in a startup, because at some point you are only going to be subject to opportunistic attacks, things from scanning for vulnerabilities that you might happen to have. But at some point you're going to start being targeted, and it might be because you got your first press release, or you happen to go viral someplace, or you implemented some new infrastructure, and now all of a sudden the telephone fraudsters have found you and they're starting to take advantage of your infrastructure. So it's time to start worrying about telephone fraud. Um, I wish, somebody could. I believe somebody has written a book about security for startups. Does anybody remember what that is? Well, anyway, I think I made it through the chat here.